pack your things and get out of my kitchen. That's what my son-in-law said to me. In my own kitchen. The one I built with my hands 31 years ago when this house was nothing but framed walls and sawdust. I stood there holding a mug of coffee, my coffee from my machine, in my kitchen, and I looked at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed like he owned the place. And I thought, he actually believes that. My name is Stuart Cole. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years working as a civil engineer for the county, raised 2 kids, mostly on my own, after my wife Barbara passed from cancer back in 2009, and I built a decent life on a quiet cul-de-sac in Roanoke, Virginia. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a backyard big enough for a garden, and a workshop out back where I spend most of my evenings. It's not a mansion, but it's mine. Paid off the mortgage 11 years ago. I have the deed in a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet. I want you to understand that before I tell you everything else. My daughter Renee, she's 34, met her husband Derek about 5 years ago at some fitness class in Charlotte. She called me excited, told me he was charming, ambitious, the kind of man who had big ideas. I drove down to meet him that first Thanksgiving, and I'll be honest, he made a good impression. Firm handshake, looked me in the eye, said all the right things. I thought my daughter had done well for herself. They got married in the spring of 2021. Small ceremony, outdoor, and I walked her down a gravel path between rows of white folding chairs, and I cried a little behind my sunglasses. I was happy for her. I genuinely was. The first signs came slowly, the way these things always do. Derek was in commercial real estate, or at least that's what he called it. He had a business partner named, well, it doesn't matter what his name was, and together they were always working on the next deal, the next property, the next big thing that was just about to close. Renee had a good job as a hospital administrator. She was the one actually bringing in steady income. I noticed that, but I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place. They moved into a rental apartment in Charlotte, and for the first couple of years, things seemed fine. Renee called me every Sunday. Derek was polite when they visited. I had no reason to worry. Then the calls started changing. Renee would call on a Tuesday afternoon, which she never used to do, and she'd sound tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She'd talk around things, mention that Derek's deal had fallen through, that they were going to be tight this month, that the market was rough. I'd offer to help, and she'd say no. They were fine. Derek had something in the pipeline. In early 2023, she called me on a Wednesday morning and said they needed to move. Their landlord had sold the building and they had 60 days. She asked if they could stay with me just for a little while, just until Derek closed the deal he was working on, maybe 2 or 3 months. I said yes without hesitating. She's my daughter. They arrived on a Saturday in March with 2 rental trucks and more furniture than I had room for. My garage filled up within an hour. Derek shook my hand at the door and said, "We really appreciate this, Stuart. We'll be out of your hair before you know it." The first month was fine. Awkward, the way sharing a house always is, but manageable. I adjusted my schedule, gave them space, stayed in my workshop most evenings. Derek would sometimes join me for coffee in the morning, and we'd talk about baseball or the news. I thought maybe I'd been too quick to judge him. By the second month, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Derek would finish the coffee without making more, leave dishes in the sink, park his truck behind my car in the driveway so I had to ask him to move it if I needed to go somewhere. Not hostile things, exactly, just careless, like he'd forgotten he was a guest. Then the medium things. He started having work calls for my kitchen table, long calls that filled the whole room with his voice, and when I'd come in to make lunch, he'd wave me off like I was interrupting something important. He rearranged the living room furniture without asking, moved my reading chair out of its spot by the window, and replaced it with their sectional sofa. When I mentioned it, he said, "Oh, come on, Stuart, this is way more comfortable. You'll love it." I moved my chair back. He didn't say anything, but that evening I heard him tell Renee in the hallway that I was being difficult. The 3rd month came and went. Then the 4th. When I asked Renee about the timeline, she said Derek's deal was almost there, maybe another 6 weeks. I nodded and let it go. By the fall of 2023, they had been living in my house for 7 months. Derek stopped asking about anything. He just did what he wanted. He invited his friends over on football Sundays without mentioning it to me, and I'd come home from my morning walk to find 6 men I'd never met, sitting in my living room with cases of beer, one of them using my grill on the back deck. When I walked in, Derek said, "Hey, grab a chair, we were just about to watch the pregame," like it was his house and I was a neighbor who'd stopped by. I didn't grab a chair. I went to my workshop and stayed there until they left. That night, I tried to talk to Renee alone. I told her things needed to change. She cried and said she knew. She was sorry. Derek was under a lot of stress. The deal was so close. She asked me to be patient just a little longer, and because she was my daughter, and I loved her and I could hear something scared underneath all her words, I agreed to try. That was my mistake. Not a catastrophic one. Just the kind a father makes when he loves his child more than he loves his own peace of mind. Things did not get better. Derek began making comments at dinner. Subtle at first. Remarks about how I organized the pantry, how I loaded the dishwasher, how I kept the thermostat too low. Then less subtle. He'd correct me in front of Renee about things that were none of his business. Tell me the way I'd always grilled a steak was wrong. Say I didn't understand how mortgage refinancing worked as if I hadn't owned property for 3 decades. I bit my tongue more times than I can count. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. I was raised to believe that most problems resolve themselves if you give them enough room. My father used to say that the best response to a fool is patience. I had been patient. I kept waiting for that to mean something. In November, 2 things happened. The first was that Derek's deal finally closed. I found out not from him or Renee, but from a phone call I accidentally overheard when he was on the back deck and I was in the workshop with the window cracked. He was talking to someone, his partner, I assumed, and he sounded jubilant. Said something about more than they expected, and time to make some moves. I waited to see if he'd say anything about moving out. He didn't. Not that day, not that week, not that month. The second thing that happened in November was that I discovered, almost by chance, that Derek had been going through my mail. I had a letter from my financial advisor that I was expecting, a summary of my retirement account, and the property valuation I'd requested. I come in every year around that time to make sure everything is in order. Barbara always handled the finances, and when she passed, I made myself learn, made myself pay attention, because I knew no one else would do it for me. The letter had been opened, carefully, with a letter opener or something similar, and then resealed with a small piece of tape. It wasn't obvious, but I'd seen enough careful work in my years as an engineer to recognize when something had been tampered with. The seam didn't match. I kept that letter. I didn't say anything, but I started paying closer attention. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that Derek was asking different kinds of questions. Casual ones dropped into conversation like they meant nothing. What did I think the house was worth these days? Had I ever thought about downsizing? Did I have a good accountant? What was my plan for retirement, really? I answered vaguely. I started keeping my financial documents in my workshop instead of the home office. I put a simple sliding bolt on the workshop door from the inside. In January, Renee told me they were thinking of staying longer. Indefinitely was the word she used. Derek thought it made more financial sense to bank what they earned from his deal while the housing market stabilized. She said it like it was already decided, and I realized that in her mind it was. I sat with that for a few days. Then I made some calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman named, well, I'll just say she's sharp as a tack and she's been my attorney for 16 years. I laid everything out, the mail, the questions, the timeline. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she said, "Stuart, you have every right to ask them to leave. This is your property. 30 days written notice." She also said something else that I wrote down and read again several times. Document everything. Be calm. Don't tip your hand. The second call was to my accountant. I had him run a full audit of my accounts, change my passwords and account numbers, and add a 2-factor authentication to everything. While we were at it, I refinanced my homeowner's policy to make absolutely sure it was in my name only with a new agent of record. It cost me about $400 in administrative fees, and it was worth every cent. The third call was to my son Edmund. He lives in Portland, and we don't talk as much as we should, but he's a good man with a level head. I told him what was happening. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Dad, do you want me to come down there?" I told him not yet, but knowing he knew made me feel less alone. In February, I typed up a formal notice. 30 days, as my attorney instructed. I asked Derek and Renee to vacate the property by March 15th. I slid it under their bedroom door on the Sunday evening. Renee came out 20 minutes later in tears. She said she couldn't believe it, that this was her childhood home, that I was throwing her out. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I was not throwing her out. I was asking them to make other arrangements, that I had been patient for 11 months and that it was time. She went back into the room. I heard Derek's voice, low and controlled, and then louder, and then Renee's again, then nothing. Derek knocked on my bedroom door at 9:30 that night. I opened it. He was standing in the hallway with his arms crossed, the same way he'd stood in my kitchen that first morning. He told me I was making a serious mistake, that Renee was devastated, that I clearly didn't understand what they'd been doing for me, keeping the house lively, keeping me from being lonely, helping manage things around the property. He actually used that word, manage, as if he'd been doing me a favor by living rent-free in my house for nearly a year. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "You know this house is going to be Renee's anyway, right? Might as well start thinking of it that way." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Good night, Derek," and I closed the door. I did not sleep much that night, not from worry exactly, more from the strange stillness of finally knowing exactly what I was dealing with. The next morning I called my attorney again and told her what Derek had said. She told me to write it down with the date and time and keep it with the other documentation. I did. Over the following 2 weeks, things in the house became cold. Derek stopped speaking to me directly. Renee alternated between crying and barely looking at me. I continued my routine: morning walk, coffee, workshop, dinner, television, bed, and I kept my composure. I was not cruel to them. I was simply clear. On March 15th, they were still in the house. I called my attorney. She sent a formal letter that afternoon via certified mail. She also connected me with a process server for what might come next, though we both hoped it wouldn't. That evening, Derek confronted me in the driveway when I came back from my walk. He said the letter was a threat, and that I had no idea who I was dealing with. He said Renee had rights to this property based on expected inheritance and that he'd consulted a lawyer. I asked him for the lawyer's name. He didn't give it to me. I went inside and called my attorney that night, and she confirmed what I already suspected. Renee had no legal claim to my home. It was my property, my deed, my name. Unless I had a will that said otherwise, which I did not, since I had quietly updated mine in February, she had no recourse. Derek had been bluffing, or he'd been badly misinformed, or both. My attorney filed for formal eviction proceedings the following week. I want to be honest about how that felt. It did not feel like a victory. It felt like a door closing on something I'd hoped would turn out differently. Renee is my daughter. I love her. I watched her take her first steps across the kitchen floor of that house. The idea that we had gotten here, that things had deteriorated to the point of legal proceedings, that sat in my chest like a stone. But I also thought about that opened envelope, about the questions Derek had been asking, about the word manage, about what might have happened if I had been a different kind of man, less attentive, more trusting, more eager to avoid discomfort. I thought about the men and women I knew who had quietly lost their footing in their own lives because they couldn't bring themselves to draw a line. I drew the line. They moved out on a Tuesday in late March. Derek rented a truck, and they were gone by 2 in the afternoon. He did not say goodbye to me. Renee knocked on my workshop door before she left. I opened it, and she stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. I said, "I love you. That doesn't change." She cried. She said she needed time. I said I understood and that I'd be here when she was ready. Then she walked to the truck and they drove away, and I stood in the driveway until they turned off the cul-de-sac and I couldn't see them anymore. I went back inside. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in almost a year. I made a pot of coffee. I sat in my reading chair back in its spot by the window where it belongs. The afternoon light came in the way it always does around 4 o'clock in March, slanted in pale gold, and I sat there and just breathed. 3 months later, Renee called me on a Sunday. It was the first call in a long time that felt like the old ones. She said she'd been thinking about a lot of things. She said Derek's deal, the one he claimed had closed in November, had actually started to unravel. There had been problems with the partnership. She was vague on the details and I didn't push, but I understood that she was beginning to see some things more clearly. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. About her work, about a trip she was thinking about taking, about her mother, which we don't do often. At the end she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I told her she didn't have to say that. She said she wanted to. I don't know what happens next. Maybe she and Derek work things out. Maybe they don't. That's not my story to write. My story is the one that takes place in a house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Roanoke, Virginia, where the reading chair is back by the window, where the coffee machine is mine, where every room holds 30 years of a life I built. I worked for what I have. I grieved for what I've lost. And I learned, later in life than I'd have liked, that loving someone and protecting yourself are not mutually exclusive. You can do both. You have to do both. Where are you listening from today? And I want to ask you something I've been thinking about since all of this happened. If you found yourself in my shoes, how long would you have waited before you drew your own line? I still think about the moment I stood in that driveway watching the truck turn off the cul-de-sac. There was no triumph in it, just the particular quiet of a thing that has finally stopped. What happened to me, to Derek, to Renee, to all of it, didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a long chain of small choices, his and mine both. Derek chose to read my mail. He chose to ask questions that weren't his to ask. He chose to say the words, "This house is going to be yours anyway," like that was a fact he could simply announce into existence. And I chose for too long to say nothing. Every time I bit my tongue when he waved me out of my own kitchen, every time I accepted just a few more weeks without pushing back, I was making a choice too. I told myself it was patience. Looking back, some of it was patience. Some of it was avoidance. There's a difference, and I wish I'd known it sooner. What turned things around wasn't anger. I never really got angry, not in any way that drove me. What turned things around was the moment I opened that envelope and saw the tape along the seam. Something in me went very still and very clear. I stopped hoping the situation would resolve itself, and I started thinking. That kind of clear-eyed thinking, knowing what you're actually dealing with, resisting the urge to soften it because the truth is uncomfortable. That's what kept me from losing something I'd spent a lifetime building. I've learned that being a good person doesn't mean being an easy target. I tried to be fair to Derek. I gave him time, gave him the benefit of the doubt, gave him more grace than he'd earned. That was the right thing to do. But there's a version of goodness that tips over into something else, a willingness to let things slide because confrontation feels unkind. That version will cost you. It nearly cost me my home. Real integrity, I think, means being honest about what's happening even when honesty is inconvenient. It means treating yourself with the same decency you extend to everyone else, and it takes something to follow through. It's easy to know what should be done. It's harder to sit down at a desk and type out a third-day notice to your own daughter. It's harder to listen to her cry through the door and not go back on it. I won't pretend that part was easy. It wasn't. But I've come to believe that the hardest thing and the right thing are often the same thing, and that doing it anyway, quietly, without drama, without cruelty, is what I'll look back on with peace. The reading chair is back by the window. The house is mine, the way it's always been. Renee and I are finding our way back to each other slowly, which is how trust is rebuilt when it's been broken, not all at once, but one Sunday phone call at a time. I don't know what I'd say to Derek if I ever saw him again. Probably nothing much. He taught me something valuable without meaning to. that the most important lines you draw in life are the ones you draw for yourself, not for an audience. Nobody saw me make those 3 phone calls. Nobody was watching when I slid that notice under the door. I did it because it was right, not because anyone would know. That, I think, is the only kind of standing firm that actually holds.